Hello everybody and welcome to the very first episode of Mental Wealth Mondays. Before I introduce myself, why Mental Wealth Mondays? Well, first and the most obvious, this podcast will air every Monday. It will be a brief way for men as well as women and any other gender to start their week with a focus on mental health, with recent studies, a couple tips, and some quotes. And why mental wealth? Well, they say that health is wealth, and the mind is our most valuable asset, and we should treat it as such. And my name is Joseph Snyder. I am 24 years old and I'm a film and media arts major at York College of Pennsylvania. I grew up in an unconventional household, that being I was raised by a single mother. My father left when I was very young, and because of this, my mother placed me into therapy when I was very young, and she always spoke to me about my emotions, always asking me how I felt, and the same was required out of me out of every therapist I ever had, and I always had one from elementary school, middle school, and even some parts of high school. And for a brief period during elementary school, I actually participated in art therapy, which was on weekends, Saturday and Sunday, early in the morning, and I would go visit with a therapist, work with clay, draw, and talk about my feelings. As a young man, I wholeheartedly believed that being raised with the awareness of my emotions was very critical to my development, which is exactly why I find a great passion in speaking about this topic. But why prioritize men's mental health? Did you know that November is Men's Mental Health Month? 1 out of 8 men suffer from depression. 1 out of 5 men suffer from anxiety. The main topic of this podcast will be about men's mental health and how it's often overlooked and under-discussed in male social circles due to stigma. This stigma exists in men regardless of ethnicity, culture, age. It exists within all of us, and a lot of it is due to masculinity. Men don't like feeling vulnerable, and a lot of us feel like we're going to be called a coward or a p*** because we're talking about how we feel. And that gets in the way of us seeking necessary services. My main intention with this podcast is to create a dialogue which is essential for men to understand their mental health and is really the only way that we can improve mental health on an individual and collective basis. Before discussing a study about this male stigma, I figured I'd discuss it with a good friend of mine, Austin Kohler. Austin, how are you doing?
Pretty good, man. How are you?
I'm feeling alright, man. Quick tip, fellas, it's not hard to ask your friends how are they doing. Just asking that opens the door to so many conversations which could improve either of your mental health. Do you think about your mental health often?
Yeah, pretty frequently, yeah.
Do you think it's important to analyze every now and again about how you might feel about in regard to your anxiety, maybe feelings of depression? Do you think it's important to self-analyze?
You definitely have to address the issues going on in your head and like day to day, because if you don't, it's just going to build up and eventually it's just going to lead to the things that, aren't exactly pleasant, such as suicide. And
men are 4 to 5 times more likely than women to take their own life. And men make up 75 to 80% of people who take their own life.
So I definitely think it's important to step back at least, once a week and kind of just analyze exactly how you're feeling. Don't sugarcoat it to yourself. Don't really oh, well, that's not that bad. If it makes you feel some type of way, then it's important. Just a lot of people, I think, shrug things off when it happens and they kind of, oh, it's not that big of a deal. But, a lot of it's not that big of a deal is turned into a really big deal.
Well, just as important as analyzation, I think, is conversating about it. And there is a very common reluctancy in men to discuss the state of their mental health with other men. Why do you think that is?
I think it's kind of a stigma to talk about against talking about your mental health as a man, because, you're supposed to be a man and, oh, you're supposed to be tough, man. Oh, why are you crying? Oh, why you feel sad, dude? Come on, man, you're a man, A lot of the dudes that I know, most of them are pretty depressed, but they won't talk about that to a lot of people because they just don't want to feel vulnerable, and there's not really a lot of embrace around that for men. They don't have, there is help, but there's not a lot of specific help.
A lot of the reason why men might not get help, which I'm looking into a study right now in regard to, is the stigma. And that these services do exist, but they're often ignored due to this stigma. And the stigma is what gets in the way of most men being treated for their mental illness. Creating a dialogue like we are right now, I believe, is really it's a start to a solution. It's not a solution in itself, but it's really the only way that we can ever properly address and assess these issues. So that's why I thank you so much for coming on and discussing this with me, Austin. I appreciate it.
No problem.
That actually perfectly prefaced this week's study. In 2019, the University of Technology in Sydney, Australia conducted a focus group study in order to determine the relationship between social stigmas and men accessing mental health services. Participants were men 18 years and older that were interested in making healthy lifestyle changes, and stakeholders working in men's health or community-based organizations and groups working to support men's well-being. There are a lot of conclusions made in this wide-ranging study, but most imperatively that gender roles and social scripts often got in the way of men accessing mental health services. Many listeners might wonder how they can negate these stigmas in order to either seek treatment or just speak about their emotions. My advice to every listener would be to ignore these stigmas. Not every stigma, because some stigmas are very important. But stigmas in regard to upholding perceived masculinity are entirely baseless. And never be afraid to speak about how you feel, because that is the most critical aspect of maintaining your mental health. Of course, it is good to consider these things internally, but a lot of information comes up through discussing your emotions. New perspectives, and new solutions too. I conclude with both a quote and a joke. Legend Fred Rogers once stated, "Anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. When we can talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary." And to end with a joke, I'd tell you a fart joke, but I feel like I've already ran out of gas. I used to tell a lot of jokes about farting, but everybody kept telling me that they stunk. Okay, one more. What is the smelliest type of jacket you can buy? A windbreaker. Alrighty guys, have an incredible week. Speak about how you feel, and I will see you guys next Monday on Mental Wealth Mondays.